you think most people in your network, people that matter to you, think one should do? You collect all this data. Then we want to know the causal influence. This is crucial. So what do I do? A very simple way of doing that is to use vignettes. And I give you an example, still linked to nutrition. So suppose that we have collected empirical normative expectation. Remember, normative expectation about other people beliefs of what should be done, not your own belief. Important. I measure this and I measure the other. So let's say I tell you the following story. There is a woman that lives in a village very similar to yours. Okay, let's call her Malia. And Malia has been in this new village for a month or so. Is living there, moved recently. And she realizes that most other young mothers nurse their children since birth. Okay, so there is an empirical expectation. However, she also observes and sees that they don't think this should be done. Okay, there is no push to do that as is the right thing to do or whatever. What do you think Malia will do? This is one example. Other people, we ask the same story, but in that village, Malia realizes that nobody gives colostrum to their babies. And however, the normative expectation is different. We tell that Malia learns that many women think one should give colostrum, but they don't. What do you think Malia will do? And this is very important, especially the difference between the empirical and the normative, because it tells us whether empirical information is more relevant than the normative, and what people believe Malia will do will be exactly what they will do in the same situation. And of course, I also use congruent empirical and normative, and so empirical positive, normative positive, empirical negative, normative negative. So there are 4 possible cases, and I put people, I randomize people, especially women in this case, in one of these 4 cases. Then I aggregate the responses. And if you see that behavior really depends on this type of social information, then you think there is a norm. Whether social or descriptive depends what matters more, or both, they matter both. But if I give you empirical says yes, normative says no, and you follow the empirical, it means it's a descriptive norm. The normative has no bite. So I measure that with vignette, and also there is a statistical measure. You want to see if behavior is predicted. You do correlation and company. Is predictive. Behavior is predicted by empirical versus normative expectation. If it's not predicted by this expectation, okay, if statistically they don't matter, then there is no norm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, I like the way you describe using the vignettes, which is similar to some other projective kind of techniques that we've used in some of our qualitative formative research. So, but it sounds also rather, quantitative. Like, so how big are your sample sizes for something like this? Or is is it really a convenience sample once you reach saturation, or you have a pretty
No, 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 no. We do very accurate statistical
okay.
sampling.
Yeah.
We have so well, it
Sounds very
depends.
expensive.
Uh, I don't think so. What the most expensive thing is the survey.
Right.
In my group, I have statisticians. They do that all the time.
Right.
They do the sampling,
Yeah, and
and
typically, I mean, we would do the same thing for a
I
baseline or
have
something, right?
statistician. I'm sure they do that
Right.
normally.
Right.
So you want a random sample of the population, and you have to decide, how to do that, etc. But this is pretty standard. A less standard thing, which is very, very important, is the identification of the reference group.
Mm-hmm.
This is very, very important. I give you an example. I was convinced that working on sanitation, building toilet, open defecation in India, I was convinced that neighbors play a huge role. If neighbors have latrines, well, people will want to build latrines. Wrong. Our analysis of networks uncovered that the most important people in deciding to build a latrine, a toilet, and then using it are family and close friends. So if a neighbor is family and close friends, fine. But if a neighbor is not family or close friends, they count for zero. Okay, so it's very, very important to realize who the reference network is, because sometimes these are not the closest people from a purely spatial viewpoint. And you have to know that. You have to realize that.
That's great. So how do you, in this same kind of initial research process, I'm guessing you go through a process to recognize who this reference group is, and how do you, at what stage do you suggest we do it in nutrition, and how do you suggest we do it? Because
Uh,
again, I think, we do something similar to what you said, that we talk to people about who influences their behavior. We often get the same answers. It's mothers-in-laws, it's husbands, it's sisters, right? And so we just kind of go with those influencers, and we don't really do much to dig a bit further.
okay, I would not ask who influence. I would ask question like, if you have a question about, in nursing your newborn, who would you go to? Okay, so more generic question, because if you ask about influence, and they know, in their environment, the mother-in-law is influential, they would answer that for sure. So you want to know who are the people they go to for different things related to nutrition. So you will have a list of potential things that matter to childhood nutrition, and you will ask people, who do you go to for this? Who do you go to for that? Who are the people that will tell you about blah, blah, blah. I would not use the word influence. You can infer influence from this question, the answer to this question.
Okay, that's helpful. Sorry, so we lost Joe for a minute, but I think he's back. I just want to confirm.
Yeah, it's very sorry about that.
Okay,
Never a dull moment in technical difficulties, right?
Yeah, it just never ends,
do you
does it?
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine, Christina.
So what I said is you don't ask who influences you. You infer it from the question you ask. And the question you ask are questions about. If you have a question about, or if you have a need about, and all these things are related to childhood nutrition, for example, who are the people? Give me 5 names of the people that you would go to, okay? And these would be the cheapest network analysis is called egocentric network method. So each person will give you 5 names, and then you do an analysis of who these people are, and in order of importance, and then you can infer who influences whom.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. So once we realize that we have a social norm, uh, how do we actually go about changing?
Okay, this is a crucial question. When something is a social norm, so there is a strong normative component, usually if people violate it, there will be some sort of sanction. Okay, it could be minimal, there will be people will gossip about them, or it could be major, sometimes violence, etc. And so people have to feel safe in behaving differently. Okay, and so in my model, what you need to change first and foremost are the empirical expectation. So what you change is the belief that yes, there are people that are changing behavior. Yes, there are people that are behaving differently and they are not killed. They can do it. And sometimes you have trendsetters. You have people within the community. In my book, Norms in the Wild, I give the example of the wife of the village leader that started nursing her kids, and people saw that they were very healthy and happy, and so, but she had power. Okay, so it could be a very influential person that starts doing that, what I call a trendsetter, or it could be the media. I do believe that the media have an enormous influence, in particular soap operas, because they scale up. And in a soap opera, you would see a village woman like you that does something different and is successful. And it goes through hurdles, as you would do in your village, but there is success at the end of the way, of the road. And so there are various ways you can act to change the empirical expectation, i.e. to show people that you can act differently and do not suffer terrible consequences. This is very important. Another way to do that, you suppose that people know that other women, obey the mother-in-law and don't do XYZ. Then you can have, let's say, focus groups or group of women that commit to change behavior. And if they are trusted in the community, it will lead to a change in empirical expectation, because I believe that all these women will act differently. And if I believe that, I fear less punishment if I do it myself. So, but it's very important to change the factual expectations, that the other people are doing it and are not being killed for that.
You mentioned scale up. Could you talk a little bit about that? About
Oh yeah, I am. This is my big thing, because I've been dealing with sanitation a lot, and there were lots of good programs, but very small. Linked to villages, what to do with a village, etc. The problem is we have entire nations, big countries, and we want big change, sustainable big change, scaling up. The only way to scale up is through the media. And how through the media? I think we have a lot of evidence by now that soap operas, the type of edutainment, very good ones, have an enormous effect on the population. People can identify with these characters. People see that this character are trendsetters, are doing different things, are doing things differently. And though they go through hurdles, they might fight with the mother-in-law in the soap opera, of course, and the husband may be upset, etc. But in the end, they triumph. And this is a very powerful incentive to change behavior. So I am a strong believer in doing very good soap operas.
So that's really interesting, Christina. I think we'd love to know if you have experience with kind of the scale up of this in nutrition, but then also, I think a lot of times we use kind of PSAs or short 1 minute or 40-second radio spots or TV spots or something to kind of scale this up. But is that enough, or do we really need to infiltrate?
No, it's not enough. It's not enough. I think, especially if you see that the problem is really persistent, you evaluate your intervention and you can say, are they successful or not? And are they successful longitudinally in the long run? Now, suppose the answer is no. And the answer is no, exactly because people have to absorb, internalize this message. They have to see that people they can identify with behave differently. And so it takes some time. And I can tell you the most successful soap operas that have been studied have lasted quite a long time.
Yeah, so it's really that kind of longer term, people need to identify with the character and really understand the character. And even nowadays, I think it's, in social media, this is working too with these social media influencers.
Oh, it's also very important if you have let's say, a famous Bollywood actress. I just finished a paper on trendsetters in sanitation in India. And the person we interviewed was a very famous Bollywood actor. And this guy understood the power of the media. And so he decided to do this movie, which is now viral. It's called Toilet, A Love Story. I don't know if you know about it.
And we're definitely going to have to Google this now. For
and
sure.
He says, nobody wanted to produce it.
Oh my gosh.
Who wants to learn about shit? They want to hear about love and this and that. And they put love with that because, the wife say, I divorce you if you don't build a toilet. But it is an interesting story. And he insisted. And he made it, and it had an enormous success.
Oh, we're definitely going to have to look this up now. That sounds fantastic.
Look at that, because and this guy is a trendsetter. He knows he's so popular. He's a top Bollywood actor. And Bollywood has been very, very important in changing other behaviors, like going against arranged marriages, or letting girls go on with their studies. That we have had a lot of good Bollywood stories about that. And we know that they are causally relevant. They change people attitudes, if you want, or beliefs, or behavior, moreover, because the people that were acting in these Bollywood comedies or soap operas received thousands and thousands of letters of young people asking them to talk with their parents because they really want to marry for love and go to university, things like that.
Yeah.
So they have a huge effect. So if you can do something on nutrition, well done, an interesting soap opera where nutrition is part of it, you will be very successful. I can predict that.
Have you seen examples of that? I know that Alive and Thrive recently supported a number of organizations and the government in Myanmar that did a campaign about 6 months exclusive breastfeeding, and they brought in a lot of Burmese actresses and different kind of champions to really push this idea. They did a huge campaign, which I think was pretty successful, but again, it was kind of a short-term campaign. It wasn't like, really infiltrating the media market.
Exactly, exactly. One thing is scaling up, and they have done probably that. The second is sustainability. So is the change sustainable? Have you really changed behavior for good? And I tell you, in my experience, to change behavior for good, it takes time.
Right.
Okay, it takes time. And so in this case, I would do a longitudinal study in Myanmar and see, for different media intervention, what has worked, what worked better, what didn't work, etc. You have to do longitudinal studies.
Right. And have you seen it, have you seen these kind of successes in the same way that we've had some of this in WASH? Have you seen it for nutrition or for child
Not for
feeding?
nutrition, not for nutrition. There are some very famous soap operas. One started in Peru, but went all over Latin America. It's called Simplemente Maria. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it lasted a few years, and it induced very poor women to change their behavior, to get trained for, a very simple job, but to do that, to get out of the home, to get more courage to do things on their own, and so on and so forth. There are other famous soap operas in Brazil. Everything has been studied. They create demographic changes. In this soap opera, which is very interesting because there was a control. This soap opera was aired only in certain parts of the northeast of Brazil, not in other parts. And following through, you see that women of the same age of the protagonist ask more often for a divorce, were less prone to accept a violent husband, decided not to have children anymore, and find a job.
Interesting.
And this is studied by economists.
So, pessimistic point of view here. Do you think it's too complicated? Are there too many nutrition behaviors? Are they too nuanced? Is it something that just doesn't really parlay very well in kind of to change social norms around it in mass media this way at scale? Or what do you think?
No, it depends. Choose your battles, I would say. If the most important thing is, do exclusive breastfeeding since birth for a certain amount of time, I would focus on that. But for example, in Mali, it has been apparently quite successful, but the big issue is the other nutrition. They give children things that they may not do good for their health. And so in that case, I would focus on sort of more comprehensive nutrition for children. Okay, depends. Again, it depends. There is no unique thing. What has been very unique is being, exclusive breastfeeding from birth.
And I
that
think
you can do a
that's
lot.
easier, right? So I think oftentimes we focus on that because it's a bit easier and it is focused. And it's, kind of one thing and it's easier for people to digest. And I think that's where in child feeding with complementary feeding, we really struggle with this because it is so many different behaviors. And they change, every few months they kind of change too. And so I think this is where we really struggle.
Well, but there are things in complementary feeding that we consider damaging. Okay, and I would focus on these and how to substitute this damaging thing with things that are easier to achieve for these populations, I would do that.
Right. And maybe, like you said, it's focusing on the overnutrition or the junk food or, depending on the context, of course, what it is that.
Have we been successful in America with junk food?
Oh, no. I mean, we haven't been successful in America with any of this, honestly.
But if there were soap operas
Yeah.
that show people that watch them, that there are some people that eat junk food, that junk food is not good, is not fashionable, is not something to do, and there are better alternatives. The problem is the alternative should not be a raw carrot because
Yeah,
it's not very appealing.
make those vegetables really stars.
Yeah, vegetables can be excellent if you know how to cook them.
Yeah.
So you have to teach people these kind of things.
Right. Thank you.
Okay.
Joe?
Yeah, Christina, could you tell us a little bit about, or talk a bit about measuring the changes in social norms, which is
Yes.
related to what you've talked about?
Yes. Crucial question. So I do an initial survey, you know that, with the factual beliefs, the personal normative, the empirical normative expectation. I measure, whether they have a causal influence. Technically, I say, do you have conditional preference for that behavior conditional on the expectations? So I have all my baggage. And we decide, let's say, to do an intervention. Typically, what we would do are RCTs, randomized control trials. So so let's say I decide to do some media intervention, and I can do different media interventions using different tools and maybe giving different messages, but I do all that. And I realize that some of them have better effect than other, let's say, okay? Then what I do, so we do a major intervention using what we have learned are successful ways to intervene in the situation. So you always have to do RCTs, okay, control trials. Then you do your intervention, and then you measure again using the same survey tools that we use at the beginning, 6 months after the intervention, a year, 2 years after the intervention. So you want to see if there was success, and even if there was success, if there is slippage. Because given the survey that you did, in my case, I do that all the time, I can put my finger on the reason why there was a slippage. You don't normally. So you repeat the survey over time, and you should see if the good behavior stabilizes. There is a change in empirical expectation. The people start thinking that other people are behaving that, and probably there is also a change in normative. Also because when we see a lot of people behaving in a particular way, it has an effect on our evaluation. We start thinking, well, they behave that way, they must approve of that. They must think we should do like that. Okay, so there is always a normative coda, normative following there. So we redo the survey again and again, and suppose that you see there is a slippage. Then through the survey, you will know where there is the cause of the slippage.
Can you give an example?
Okay, I give you immediately the first study I did for Pakistan. They did an intervention, a CLTS typical intervention on open defecation. Very successful. After 6 months, disaster. They went back to OD. Oh my, why? The interesting thing in my first, that was my first evaluation, they hadn't used my survey. Okay, so I didn't have a comparison. Still, I did the survey. And what I realized is that people had good, not full, but good new empirical expectation. They expected that most people were using toilet. But they had zero normative. They did not expect that people approve of using toilets. They didn't expect any sanction for defecating in the open, etc. And that was a problem. Okay, that's why it declined. But if I had since the beginning done my study, done the intervention based on the study, and then I see the slippage, I redo the survey and point my finger, as I did in this case. I said their normative beliefs have not changed. So, why not defecate in the open? Nobody's going to tell me anything. Who cares?
Okay, so so you measure the behavior change, and you see the behavior change. Do you assume that norms changed too?
You have to check for that. You have to check. So you have to check if their social expectations have changed. That's very important. Do they believe now that most people are behaving in the right way? Or do they believe that only a minority does that? Do they believe that most people, again, in their relevant network, in their environment, have changed their evaluation of this behavior or not? This is crucial. You want to know that.
I think that's really interesting, Christina, because I think often what happens is we do focus so much on the behavioral outcome or even the nutrition outcome. And so, of course, with wearing my social and behavior change hat, we're always pushing to really be tracking these intermediate outcomes, as we would call them. But
Yeah.
but not everyone is thinking about them. And I think the counter argument perhaps is, well, who cares? We changed the behavior. We don't really care why it changed. So
If it is, to tell you the truth, if you change the behavior and it's stable over time, it's fine. But usually it's not stable over time. Here you have to worry. So you want to change behavior, but you want to change behavior permanently.
Right.
This is the problem. And that's why you need these pre, during, post surveys. Because if you have slippage, and in many cases we do have slippage, people go back to their former behavior or adopt the bad behaviors again, new bad behaviors, if you will, then you want to know why.
Right. Yeah. And I think, part of it is, in one study that we did, they identified that there was kind of this social desirability bias, essentially, that people were, we were getting differences in what people were telling us in our end lines versus what we were finding through scientific methods about, this one was related to exclusive breastfeeding. So,
may I interrupt you for a moment? I forgot to tell you a very important thing. When you ask about social expectation, you want to incentivize the answer to avoid the social desirability bias. So when I ask you about all this, random sample in the population, about what do you believe most other people approve of, let's say, is the normative expectation. I tell you, I have asked, I know what other people approve or disapprove of. I know the numbers because, I have done this survey about the personal beliefs of people. And therefore, I tell you, if you give me a correct answer, and again, it's not difficult, majority, minority, etc., I give you a price, and usually what we do is phone time. Everybody has a cell phone, and we give them phone time. So they have an incentive to be accurate.
That's fascinating.
You have to do that. Incentivize is the golden rule. Huh?
Wow. That, yeah, and I don't think that's, I mean, in that way, we certainly use incentives, right? But in that way, we don't, I don't think we've done that before.
You have to.
That's great.
That's why you have a discrepancy.
Which kind of leads to the next question, which is a bit about ethics of social norm change. Joe, do you want to?
Actually, I wanted to understand a little bit better that incentive.
Yes.
So can you explain it again? You're saying that.
Okay. Let me give you the story of the survey. So in your survey, you would ask about the factual beliefs, what they believe about this food, this other food, colostrum, whatever. Then you ask what I call personal normative beliefs. What do they think personally is the right thing to do? What they should do? What people should do? Okay, so they know you have asked the second question to everybody you interview. Then you ask empirical expectation. What do you think most people do? And they know, we know this. Okay, and so you can incentivize that. Be accurate. Do not project. Be accurate. And if you tell me what the majority does, what you believe the majority does, then, and it is true, you are correct, I give you some time over the phone. Last question is the normative. What do you believe most people we have interviewed approve or disapprove of, etc.? And give me, your answer. If you are correct, again, you get a prize. I give you some phone time. So you are incentivized the social expectations. So you've eliminated the desirability bias, but also the projection bias. Oh, they do as I do. Well, not necessarily. I want this incentive. Let me think.
Okay, thank you. I understand. I get that now. So, shall we go on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Christina started to ask about the ethics of the social norm change.
Yeah.
Even if we know a norm is harmful medically or developmentally, there can be unintended consequences of trying to change social norms. What are the ethical considerations, and how do we ensure we're changing norms for good?
This is very interesting because you have to decide what do you mean by ethics? Okay. And it's not clear that people have in mind something. So the usual thing that I hear is, oh, these people do certain things because it's part of their tradition, their culture. Why do you want to intervene on their culture? And, this is a good question. Okay. So what sort of considerations should play a role for us when you want, let's say, to change nutrition? Well, the issue is, the question to ask is this culturally based set of rules about nutrition, is it stunting the child, the development of the child? Is it damaging, objectively damaging the health of the child? Then you have a good reason to try to convince people to change their way. I think the only good reason is to avert harm. I think this gives us the permission to try to convince, because it's convincing. People have to be motivated to change. So to motivate people to change their behavior is harm avoidance.
Okay, so that I mean that makes sense. So we want to move on a bit, but I'm curious, according to a UNICEF document from 2005, behavior change implies individual level change. Social change seeks to create an enabling environment for change and focuses on community level behavioral change. Would you agree with this characterization of behavior and social change?
No.
How would
Okay.
you?
Well, okay, this is all the debate about nudging and norms. If you want, I have a new paper just published on norm nudging. Okay, typically, nudging, you want to change individual behavior. For example, how do we induce people to save more in their 401k? How do you induce people who have diabetes to take metformin or other medication every day? How do you induce people who are obese to diet or to eat a better diet, etc.? So there is a lot of analysis of how to do behavioral change at the individual level. However, there are lots of behavior that are collective. Okay, so even if each individual behaves in that particular way, the social dimension, the collective dimension of this behavior is relevant. So it depends what do you analyze as, oh, this is purely individual behavior versus this has a collective root. You have to be able to distinguish the two. But changing behavior, it depends what behavior you want to change and how you analyze this behavior. So that distinction is quite stupid because, for example, you may realize that obese people, and there are studies about that, sort of live with other obese people, that there is a sort of communality to that behavior. And so maybe their social expectations do play a role in their eating out of proportion. Okay, paying taxes is clearly, yes, is individual, but there is a social dimension, because if people start suspecting that other people don't pay taxes, they won't pay their taxes. Okay, so there is a social dimension to that behavior. So you have to decide if there is or there isn't a social dimension. Now, in all your studies, in all the things you do, there is clearly a social dimension. So what you change, you want to change behavior collectively. This is what I say in my 2006 book. It's obvious.
Oh no, Joe, are you there?
Yeah?
Joe? Did we lose Joe again?
He's on mute.
Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute. I don't know why, but it wouldn't let me unmute my microphone. Okay, so that's very. I think that's a very complete answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that behavior is purely individual or purely collective. You have to decide. You have to decide if there is a social dimension to that. With surveys, you decide.
So what are some key resources we should be using to better diagnose, program, and measure the influence of social norms in our nutrition programming, or in our child feeding programming?
Yeah, first of all, you have to diagnose behavior, okay? And in order to diagnose behavior, you have to ask to do survey with all the sort of issues that I just discussed with you. Okay, beliefs, expectation, preference are conditional or not, and so on and so forth. Once you have diagnosed why people behave in that particular way, then you can say, there is a social norm, or is a mixed model. So the model of nutrition, it seems to me, at least in the last analysis I did, is mixed, because there is a social norm obeying the mother-in-law, supporting certain decision about nutrition, But then there is a purely descriptive norm about, well, I do that because other people do that, and that's it. Okay, is not normative to do or not to do something. What is normative is obey the mother-in-law. So you can diagnose that with a survey, and then it tells you where to intervene, what you could do. And then you do, media intervention, trials, etc., follow through. But so basically, you have to diagnose the behavior. You don't know it is a norm. You don't know even if there is a norm involved. You have to be able to diagnose. And the kind of survey I do is a diagnostic survey.
Okay. And if you could take a step back and think about global child feeding programming related to social norms change, is there, or what is a big idea that you wish would proliferate?
Is not a single big idea. First of all, I do not believe that nutrition, the choices about nutrition per se, are social norms. First idea. I think they may be supported by social norm, but per se they are not social norm. Okay, this is the first idea. The second idea is that people will be very influenced by observing, being told through the media, whatever, about different nutrition behavior. This is the big intervention you have to do, different behavior. Convince people that they can behave differently. At that point, if they are supported by the evidence that either there is commitment or there is actual difference, maybe the translator is just an actor, but they see that, then they can overcome certain cultural norms about, like, oh, let's obey the mother-in-law that says blah, blah, blah. They say, well, she says something wrong, I shouldn't obey. Okay, but first thing, you realize that the nutrition per se is not a norm. Second, you must realize that it's supported by some norm. Third point is you have to change the empirical expectation. Then the influence of the mother-in-law may become really minor.
Uh-huh. So what should we all be doing differently to improve child feeding through social norms research and programming?
Well, first of all, you should learn, diagnose what motivates people to feed their children one way or another. Okay, this is the first thing you have to do. And surveys help. Okay, first point. Once you know what motivates them, then you can do trials, randomized trials to try different interventions. Okay, but the intervention have to be based on the data you have collected. You should not start with the preconceived idea, oh, these are social norms. You don't know. So what you do at the beginning, you do a diagnostic analysis. What motivates these people to choose X or Y or Z? Once you know that, you know how to act or interact with these people. And I think the most important point, whether it is a social norm or not, since there is a social dimension to this behavior, this is very important because people see what other people do, change their empirical expectation, change what they believe other people are going to do or are already doing. You have to change that. That's why the media are so important. And you have to check that this change is relatively permanent.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I think it's our last question. Is there another? No. What is, and that doesn't mean it's over because I know Christina and Joy may have other questions, but what is the next big thing your research or in terms of your own work related to social norms change?
Analysis of trendsetters. Who are the trendsetters? Because if I tell you two things that I'm doing, I have, if you look at my book, Norms in the Wild, how to diagnose, measure, change social norms. The last chapter is all about trendsetters and what distinguishes, what makes somebody a trendsetter. Now, the most interesting thing is where are these trendsetters? What is their position in a network? And one analysis I have done is there are trendsetters that initiate new things. Okay, so they initiate fashions, they initiate new behavior that are not against old behavior, are completely new. And typically these people may be at the center of a network, okay? Because they have a lot of links with other people, a lot of people can observe them, and so on and so forth. And, important media people are at the center of huge networks, so that they are important in this respect. But what you want to know, and which is more challenging, is who are the trendsetters who push for the end of a social norm. Okay, because social norms are usually well established, there is a risk going against them, and so the trendsetter has to have certain characteristics to go against. And typically these people will not be at the center of a network, they will be peripheral. And I've done studies about that, I'm studying it. My most recent article for, the Wharton Journal, Wharton School Journal is a business journal, is about trendsetters in India sanitation. From the Prime Minister to people in the villages, and how did they coordinate their activities. So trendsetters are crucial for the emergence of a new norm, but especially for eliminating an existing norm. They are crucial, and people will look at them. And they will have certain characteristics that they analyze.
Christina, I think that's fascinating, and I have your book, and so I've read a bit about that, and so Joy and I were actually just talking about this yesterday a little bit. Is what's on the cusp, what's coming, and I think it's so appropriate that you mentioned this idea of trendsetters, especially because the internet is reaching every corner of the globe. And one of the things that we talked about just yesterday with, what's changing in the next 5 years is people have access to information so much quicker, and they're going to be using information so much more differently. And I think one key thing is that these trendsetters are going to change so quickly. So how do we keep up with this? How do we?
It's very important. I tell you something, how I came with the idea of trendsetters. While I was doing my training with UNICEF and then I work with the Gates Foundation a lot, I started asking, okay, can you tell me in all these areas where you did your intervention, your work, were there people that were really leading the change? And in every case, the answer was yes. And then I asked, but who are these people? And typically, we are talking about eliminating a norm, an established norm. They are not, important people in the village. They are not the police chief. They are not the village chief. They are people very committed, very much believing that this norm is wrong, is bad. But on the other hand, they are not so central in the network that they will be punished. They lose the trust of people. And so I started thinking about that and looking at a lot of cases, example in which people were indeed trendsetters, and try to summarize their characteristics. And if you look at the last chapter of my book, I have a list of characteristics. And what I did recently in India, I measured this characteristic in the people I interviewed. And I was right. They possess these characteristics. And basically, what is interesting is that when you start an intervention, you may want to identify potential trendsetter because it's less costly than working with the whole indifferentiated population. So there may be people, let's say in a village, who are more committed to this change, that mostly agree with that and work at the beginning with them. Or, as I say in that chapter in the book, soap operas create trendsetters. So it's very important that the people in the soap opera who do things differently, they go through hurdles, that win, are the trendsetters that people look at. And we have a lot of evidence that this happens.
And so do you think that because I think oftentimes in nutrition, we're not as typically talking about eliminating norms, but establishing new norms. So you think it's the same, or it's a bit of
no, it's different. Establishing new norm, you still need some trendsetters.
Right.
And usually they would be more influential people, more central to the network when you establish something new, because they will have a lot of contacts with other people. So they are not peripheral, they will be more central. And if you do a network analysis, you will know who are the potential trendsetters, who are the influential people who have specific influence on that.
Right.
Okay, so women may have a lot of influence more than men because the nutrition of children is a task of women. Okay, and among the women, who could be the strongest influencers? So when you do a network analysis, as I suggest, you will know that. You can act on them first.
That's great. Yeah.
It's cheaper.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is fantastic. I feel like we just kind of drank from a fire hose a little bit. So this was great, though. You know, we've been following your work for a little while. We've read your book and seen a lot of. I've taken half of your course. I haven't finished it yet, I must admit.
Take the second half.
I haven't.
It's the best.
I'll get to it.
Because I talk about trendsetters and all this stuff. The first half is that basic.
Okay, I promise. But yeah, I think we're all learning. You know, it's just so interesting to see how much your work and even the terms you use and stuff really overlap with the way that we do work, but also is very different in some other ways.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot we can learn from your research and your experience. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay.
Yeah, let me echo that, Cristina. Honestly, that was wonderful, and you're such a dynamic speaker. And yeah, I mean, what a way for us to kick this off. So thank you so much for all the time. It was fascinating. Thanks.
Thank you. It was great. Hope to hear from you again.
Okay.
Yes, you will hear from us. We're gonna make a transcript of our conversation, and we'll probably send that along for you just to make sure that we didn't miss anything. It'll be verbatim.
Excellent.
And then we'll, as Cristina said at the outset, we'll let you know how as we progress when the series will kick off and all the rest, and probably ask for your input on.
If I can help, I will be very happy to help you. And I can show you our surveys and what we ask and how we ask, so you can learn from.
And
that would be
probably,
fantastic.
you know, I know there's a lot of things you reference too. So depending on how we edit this, of course, I'm sure there's different resources which we'll want to link out to also, like your social norms course with UNICEF, your book, obviously. So I'm sure we'll be in touch to make sure we have the best reference.
We are publishing quite a bit of stuff on the India project and what we learn, which is much more vast than the India project. So there are lots of things coming out. And you can look, actually, if you send me an email reminding me, I can send you this paper on norms and nudges that you would be very interested in, because how do they do norm nudging? What sort of information do they give people, and how wrong they may be?
Perfect. Yeah, I think I might have seen it, but just to make sure, we'll ask you for it, of course.
Okay.
Thank
Perfect.
you so much. Have a
Okay.
great afternoon.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.